Welcome to Spooky Ass Shit. I am your host, Eric Winnells, and tonight we are going to be talking about the ghosts of Forge Theater. Now, when I say ghosts this time, I don't mean literal ghosts. Well, kind of I do. But what I really mean is the events and the strange happenings that happened to the people involved with the major story of the assassination of American President Abraham Lincoln at Forge Theater in Washington, D.C. Now, this happened, of course, in 1865. I don't know how many of my international listeners are super familiar with this story, or even how many of my American listeners are super familiar with the story, so I'm going to give you a pretty good amount of background information before we really get into the subject of all the strangeness around the assassination. I want to talk about the events that took place at the theater, the assassination itself, and then I want to tell you about what happened to John Wilkes Booth, the assassin, after that. And then, of course, like I said, we're going to talk about some of the strange events that happened in the theater, around the theater, and to the people involved in the assassination. And as I listened to the playback there, I noticed that my voice did not sound right at all. Sorry about that little technical glitch. We are on the right track now. So, before we move on and talk about Forge Theater and all the events around it, I want to remind everyone to check out the show's webpage, that is spookyas.com or spookyasshit.com. They both take you to the same place, and that is the show's blog page. From there you can listen to each and every episode, even the ones no longer available on your favorite podcast streaming services. And you can also find links to our social media. We are at Spooky Ass Shit on both Twitter and Instagram, and you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/spookyas. The GoFundMe, by the way, I said I was going to close it down at the end of June. I forgot to plug it one last time. So consider this the very last time you'll hear about this particular campaign. If you have not donated yet, now is your last chance. And to those of you who already have, I cannot thank you enough. We got that digital recorder. We still have some things we want to get. So if you still are in a place where you can chip in and it slipped your mind, now's the last chance you have. So please go ahead and do that. That is gofundme.com/spookaroos19. One more thing before we move on. I want to let all of you know that the next 2 weeks I am going to be doing remix episodes, basically repeats, but I'll create a new introduction for them. And the reason for this is I need to take a little time off because I'm working on a big project for you guys for August. It's going to be a special series of episodes. We're going to do a series through the month of August about one particular topic. And I don't want to give away exactly what it is right now, so you'll have to come back and find out what it is. But I will say that at least one of the episodes I replay will touch on things involved with the new episodes that I'll be creating for you for August. But it's going to take a lot of work. I'm going to tell you, thanks to you folks out there that did contribute to the GoFundMe campaign, we're going to use that digital recorder. We're going to have some sound effects. We're going to have multiple people on the show at the same time. And we're going to have some special guests from other podcasts. So this is a big deal, and I want to make sure that I come correct, basically. So I need to take a little time to work on that, to take notes on that subject and make sure I bring it correctly. So that's why I'll be taking that time off. Don't think that I'm just being lazy. That happens sometimes, but I always let you guys know if that's the reason. I'll just say, hey, no episode this week. But normally I do get episodes out. And this one is just, I need a little time to make sure that I research everything, that I have everything that I want to present to you guys. It's a subject that's been talked about many, many times, but it's a subject that I think we're going to take a different twist on than other podcasts and TV shows and other things you might have heard about this very famous thing. I'll just say that. It's not too hard to figure out. I bet if you think hard, you can figure it out. But that's for next time when I come at you live. For now, let's talk about the ghosts of Forge Theater. Now, when we talk about the assassination of President Lincoln, of course, President Lincoln is the key figure. He was the President of the United States during the American Civil War. This was a war between the northern United States and the South. And the South, listen, it's a very complicated story. There's a lot more to it, but they usually sum it up by saying that the South wanted slavery and the North didn't. There's much more to it, but for the sake of brevity, we'll leave it there, and I'll leave it to you to research on your own. But slavery was important to the economics of the South and many other components of Southern life at the time. So slavery definitely was a part of it. Now, there were other reasons, including states' rights and other things, but the Confederates, which is what the rebels were called, the people who wanted to break away from the Union, they created their own form of government, their own president, their own army, their own military. And John Wilkes Booth is the other key figure in the assassination. He's the assassin, of course. He did not serve in either army, but he was a Confederate sympathizer. And he truly believed in the Southern cause, the Confederate cause. And he was very much anti-Lincoln, as you can imagine, since he ended up shooting him in the head. But before he did that, he actually had a conspiracy brewing with some friends of his and some fellow Confederate sympathizers, where he planned to kidnap the President of the United States and hold him hostage while this war was wrapping up. The South was losing the war. It didn't look good for them. And so this was a plan that he came up with, again, with some fellow conspirators. They were going to kidnap Abraham Lincoln and hold him for ransom, and basically ransom the southern half of the country, I guess, was the plan. And then, once the North said, okay, we give up, then they'd give Lincoln back, and we would have two separate countries here instead of one United States of America. That plan didn't exactly work out, and the war actually was officially ended just weeks before the assassination. However, that doesn't mean that all the Confederate armies gave up at once. Even after the treaty was signed and the war was declared over by both sides officially, there were still some forces out there that hadn't gotten word or just continued the fight because they still believed in the cause. So, in this way, John Wilkes Booth thought that the Confederacy still had a chance. The South will arise again, so they say, right? So that's the idea here. Yes, our leaders have given up, but we, the people of the Confederacy, have not given up, and we're going to continue this fight all the way. But it was definitely a dying movement, and they didn't have much of a chance. That's what John Wilkes Booth saw as his opportunity to step up on the stage and make a difference. And how did he do that? That's what we're going to talk about right now. You might think with his plans to conspire to kidnap the president and his interest in Southern causes and all that, maybe he was a soldier of some kind and he had the tactical ability to pull these plans off. But actually, John Wilkes Booth was a stage actor. He was an actor of some renown, and he had worked in Washington, D.C.'s Ford's Theater on numerous occasions. He became friendly with the Ford's Theater's owner, John Ford, and due to his semi-transient lifestyle as a traveling actor, he had asked Ford if he could have his mail delivered to the theater, since he didn't really have like a set home address. Ford was more than happy to oblige, being friendly with both John Wilkes Booth and his brother Edwin, who was an even more famous actor, very famous Shakespearean actor back in his day. On the morning of April 14th, 1865, Booth went to Ford's Theater to get his mail. While there, John Ford's brother mentioned that the President and Mrs. Lincoln would be attending the play Our American Cousin at the theater that evening. They would be accompanied by the United States General Ulysses S. Grant and his wife. John Wilkes Booth couldn't believe the opportunity that presented itself right in front of him. Two of his greatest enemies in his own mind, President Abraham Lincoln and his commanding officer, Ulysses S. Grant, sitting right in front of him, the two men responsible for the downfall of the Confederacy, right in front of him. He knew what he felt he had to do. He changed his plan from kidnapping to the immediate assassination of both men. He informed his former kidnapping conspiracy cohorts of the change of plans. He even gave them some side missions, which we'll get into a little bit later on. Booth's plans to assassinate Ulysses S. Grant were thwarted when Grant decided not to attend the play after all, at his wife's insistence. Instead, they traveled to New Jersey to visit some relatives. Still, Booth knew Ford's Theater like the back of his hand. He knew how to get up to the presidential box, and he knew how to escape out the back and get on his horse and get right out of town. It was too perfect. He had to take advantage of the opportunity to kill what he saw as the tyrant, President Abraham Lincoln. In addition to being familiar with the layout of the theater itself, John Wilkes Booth was also familiar with the play being presented that evening. He knew there would be a big laugh after a certain line in Act 3 of the play. He planned to shoot Lincoln as the audience laughed at this line, hoping that their laughter would drown out the sound of his pistol. Wilkes slipped into Lincoln's box that evening at around 10 p.m., just as an actor on stage was delivering the line he'd been waiting for. "Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know well enough to turn you inside out, old gal. You sock-dologizing old man-trap!" Of course, I can't hear if you're laughing right now, but that line was hilarious in 1865. Maybe it's just because it's out of context. It doesn't seem that funny to me. Maybe it's the way I'm delivering it. Maybe I'm delivering it all wrong. But in any event, in 1865, that line got the crowd roaring. And when they did, Wilkes shot the president in the back of the head. Booth's escape was almost thwarted by Major Henry Rathbone, who had taken Grant's place at the invitation of the Lincolns, along with his wife. Rathbone attempted to grapple with the fleeing Booth, but Booth turned and stabbed Rathbone in the shoulder and arm before making his escape by jumping out of the booth and onto the stage. Rathbone's fiancée, Clara Harris, and First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln were also present in the booth, but they were not harmed during the attack on the president and Rathbone. Now, like I said, Booth jumped onto the stage from the president's box, and he raised his knife and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is Latin for "thus always to tyrants." It's believed to be what Brutus said after the assassination of Julius Caesar, and it's also the Virginia state motto. But others said that he also added, "I have done it. The South is avenged." Various accounts state that Booth injured his leg and or broke his leg when his spur snagged on the decorative U.S. Treasury Guard flag that was hung over the balcony, like bunting flag basically, while he was leaping off the stage. Others say that Rathbone had kind of made him stumble when he jumped, and that is how he broke his leg. But it's more likely that he broke it later on in his escape attempt when a horse fell on him, and these stories about his leg being caught are a way to kind of mythologize Booth and make him a little bit more heroic in certain people's eyes, or make the story a little bit more interesting than the horse fell on his leg. We'll get to that in a little bit. It was a 12-foot jump, though, from the presidential box to the stage. So that's no joke. That's, a pretty big jump to go right onto a hardwood stage. So, he could have just hurt his ankle then. So as he attempted to leave by walking off the stage and exiting through the stage door, which is, behind the stage, pandemonium broke out in the playhouse. So people were going up to the president's box trying to figure out what was just happening. Booth goes to the stage door, where the door is being held for him by a stage boy, stagehand, who he had seen earlier in the night, and said, "Hey, just, make sure this door is open for me, make sure my horse is out here." And as a thanks for doing that, Booth hit him in the head with his pistol, knocking him out and getting him out of the way. Booth then jumped on his horse and escaped, accompanied by David Harold, and their plan was to travel into southern Maryland, make it into Virginia, and then perhaps off to Mexico. But we'll get to that part later on. Now, he had planned this escape route with the stable reowner of the man who gave him the horse to make his getaway on, and he had planned it to take advantage of the sparsely settled area's lack of telegraphs and railroads, and also the fact that the areas he'd be traveling through were primarily dominated by Confederate sympathizers. He thought that the area's dense forest and swampy terrain would make it ideal for his escape route into rural Virginia. At midnight, Booth and Harold arrived at Surratt's Tavern. Now, Surratt's Tavern was owned by a woman, Mrs. Surratt, who was involved with the plot to kidnap Lincoln, so they say it's a little murky. Again, that's kind of beyond the scope of this episode, but she would end up paying the ultimate price. She would be hanged for being involved with this whole plot. The fugitives continued southward, stopping before dawn on April 15th for treatment of Booth's injured leg at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, which was 25 miles from Washington. Mudd would later say that he didn't know that Booth had killed the president at that time, and that Booth told him the injury had occurred when his horse fell on him. Dr. Mudd set Booth's leg and gave him crutches, and the two fugitives continued on their way. The War Department advertised a $100,000 reward, which would be equal to about $1.64 million in today's standard. And this reward was offered by the Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, for information leading to the arrest of Booth and his accomplices. And federal troops were dispatched to search southern Maryland extensively, following up on tips reported to federal intelligence agents. Booth lay in hiding in the Maryland woods, waiting for an opportunity to cross the Potomac River into Virginia. He read the accounts of the national mourning in the newspapers. By April 20th, he was aware that some of his co-conspirators had already been arrested. Booth was surprised to find little public sympathy for his action, especially from those anti-Lincoln newspapers that had previously criticized the president in his lifetime. The news of the assassination reached all corners of the nation, and indignation was aroused against Lincoln's critics, whom many blamed for encouraging Booth to act. Now, I include this part of the story because it reminds me a lot of what's going on today. You hear a lot of people saying, well, this news channel is inciting people to do certain bad things, riot, maybe even make an assassination attempt. I think this just shows that these kind of claims are nothing new, or if the claims, it's not so much that the claims are false necessarily, but the idea that, so-called news can be fanning the flames with their opinion when they put this kind of stuff out on either side, Democrat or Republican here in the United States. But this is just a tale as old as time. So this is nothing new. This was happening back in the 1800s as well. The San Francisco Chronicle editorialized, saying, Booth has simply carried out what a succession of politicians and journalists have been for years expressing in words, who have denounced the president as a, quote, tyrant, a despot, and a usurper. They hinted at it and virtually recommended it. Booth wrote of his dismay in his journal entry on April 21st, as he awaited nightfall before crossing the Potomac River into Virginia. He wrote, quote, For 6 months we had worked to capture, but our cause being almost lost, something decisive and great must be done. I struck boldly, and not, as the papers say. I can never repent it, though we hated to kill. Booth and Harold were able to cross the Potomac River that night. Instead of reaching Virginia, though, they mistakenly navigated upriver to a bend in the broad Potomac River, coming ashore again in Maryland on April 22nd. The 23-year-old Harold knew the area well, having frequently hunted there, and recognized a nearby farm as belonging to a Confederate sympathizer. The farmer led them to his son-in-law, Colonel John J. Hughes, who provided the fugitives with food and a hideout until nightfall, for a second attempt to cross the river into Virginia. Booth again wrote in his diary that night, saying, With every man's hand against me, I am here in despair. And why? For doing what Brutus was honored for, and yet I, for striking down a greater tyrant than they ever knew, am looked upon as a common cutthroat. While Lincoln's funeral train was in New York City on April 24, Lieutenant Edward P. Doherty was dispatched from Washington at 2 p.m. with a detachment of 26 Union soldiers from the 16th New York Cavalry Regiment to capture Booth in Virginia, accompanied by Lieutenant Colonel Everton Conger. The detachment stemmed 70 miles down the Potomac River on the boat landing in Belle Plaine, Virginia, at 10 p.m. The pursuers tracked Booth and Harold to Richard H. Garrett's farm. Booth and Harold had been led to the farm on April 24 by William S. Jett, a former Confederate soldier. The Garretts were unaware of Lincoln's assassination. Booth was introduced to them as James W. Boyd, a Confederate soldier who had been wounded in the Battle of Petersburg and was simply returning home. That night's sleep in the barn would be Booth's last. Garrett's 11-year-old son, Richard Garrett, was an eyewitness. In later years, he became a Baptist minister and widely lectured on the events of Booth's demise at his family's farm. According to his account, Booth and Harold arrived at Garrett's farm at around 3 p.m. on Monday afternoon. Confederate mail delivery had ceased with the collapse of the Confederate government, he explained, so the Garretts were unaware of the Lincoln assassination. After having dinner with the Garretts that evening, Booth learned of the surrender of Johnston's army, the last Confederate armed forces of any size. Its capitulation meant that the Civil War was unquestionably over, and Booth's attempt to save the Confederacy by Lincoln's assassination had failed. The Garretts also finally learned of Lincoln's death and the substantial reward for Booth's capture. Booth, said Garrett, displayed no reaction other than to ask the family if they would turn in the fugitive, should they have the opportunity. Still not aware of their guest's true identity, one of the older Garrett sons said that they might, if only because they needed the money. The next day, Booth told the Garretts that he intended to leave for Mexico. He never had the chance. Before dawn on April 26th, the U.S. soldiers caught up with the fugitives, who were still hiding in Garrett's tobacco barn. David Harold surrendered, but Booth refused Conger's demands to surrender, saying, "I prefer to come out and fight." The soldiers then set the barn on fire. As Booth moved about inside the blazing barn, Sergeant Boston Corbit shot him. According to Corbit's later account, he fired at Booth because the fugitive had raised his pistol to shoot at them. In an 1878 interview, Corbett claimed that he saw Booth aim his carbine, prompting him to shoot Booth with his Colt revolver, despite Secretary of War Edwin Stanton's orders that Booth should be captured alive. Conger's report to Stanton stated that Corbett shot Booth, quote, "without order, pretext, or excuse," and recommended that Corbett be punished for disobeying orders to take Booth alive. Booth, fatally wounded in the neck, was dragged from the barn to the porch of the Garrett's farmhouse, where he died 3 hours later at the age of 26. The bullet had pierced 3 vertebrae in his neck and partially severed his spinal cord, paralyzing him. In his dying moments, he reportedly whispered, "Tell my mother I died for my country." Asking that his hands be raised to his face so that he could see them, Booth uttered his last words, "Useless, useless." So that is the story of John Wilkes Booth and some of the background that you need to know before we continue talking about some of the other key players that you just heard about. And the first one we're going to talk about is Thomas Boston Corbett. Now, Boston was a name that he kind of gave himself, and I'll talk about the reason for that in a little bit. But his real name is Thomas Corbett. He went by Boston later in life. As a young man, Corbett began apprenticing as a hatter, a profession that he would hold intermittently throughout the remainder of his life. As a hatter, Corbett was regularly exposed to fumes of mercury nitrate, then used in the treatment of fur and to produce felt used in making hats. Excessive exposure to this compound can lead to hallucinations, psychosis, and twitching, known as the Hatter's shakes. This is where the expression mad as a hatter comes from, because a lot of hatters did in fact go insane due to huffing all this mercury nitrate all day. After working as a hatter in the city of Troy, New York, Corbit returned to New York City. He later married, but his wife died in childbirth. Following their deaths, he moved to Boston. Corbit became despondent over the loss of his wife and began drinking heavily. He was unable to hold a job, and eventually he became homeless. After a night of heavy drinking, he was confronted by a street preacher whose message persuaded him to join the Methodist Episcopal Church. Corbit immediately stopped drinking and became devoutly religious. After being baptized, he subsequently changed his name to Boston, the name of the city where he was converted. In 1857, Corbit began working at a hat manufacturer's shop on Washington Street in downtown Boston. He was reported to be a proficient hatter, but was known to proselytize frequently and to stop work and pray and sing at co-workers who used profanity in his presence. He also began working as a street preacher and would sermonize and distribute religious literature in North Square. Corbit soon earned a reputation around Boston for being a local eccentric and a religious fanatic. On July 16, 1858, Corbit was propositioned by two prostitutes while walking home from a church meeting. He was deeply disturbed by this encounter. Upon returning to his home at the boarding house, Corbit began reading chapters 18 and 19 in the Gospel of Matthew. Quote, "And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out, and cast it from thee." This is the line basically saying, if it causes you to sin, then it's better to be minus an eye than to have your whole body cast into hell. In order to avoid sexual temptation and remain holy, Boston Corbit castrated himself with a pair of scissors. He then ate a meal and went to a prayer meeting before seeking medical treatment. So this guy, he says this is the man who would eventually shoot John Wilkes Booth, and he says he did it for righteous reasons, but I think that we see here there is perhaps a lack of solid judgment on his part much earlier on than even the, capture of John Wilkes Booth. In April of 1861, early in the American Civil War, Corbit enlisted as a private in Company 1 of the 12th Regiment of the New York Militia. Corbit's eccentric behavior quickly got him into trouble. He carried a Bible with him at all times and began reading passages aloud from it regularly. He held unauthorized prayer meetings and argued with his superior officers. Corbit also condemned officers and superiors for what he perceived as violations of God's word. In one instance, he verbally reprimanded Colonel Daniel Butterfield for using profanity and taking the Lord's name in vain. Corbit was sent to the guardhouse for several days, but refused to apologize for his insubordination. Due to his continued disruptive behavior and his refusal to take orders, Corbit was court-martialed and sentenced to be shot. His sentence was eventually reduced, and he was discharged in August of 1863. Corbit re-enlisted later that month as a private in Company L, the 16th New York Cavalry Regiment. On April 24, 1865, Corbit's regiment was the one that was sent to apprehend John Wilkes Booth. Lieutenant Colonel Everton Conger initially thought that Booth had shot himself. After realizing that Booth had been shot by someone else, Conger and Lieutenant Doherty asked which officer had shot Booth. Corbit stepped forward and admitted that he was the shooter. When asked why he had violated orders, Corbit replied, "Providence directed me." He was immediately arrested and was accompanied by Lieutenant Doherty to the War Department in Washington, D.C. to be court-martialed. When questioned by Edwin Stanton about Booth's capture and shooting, Both Doherty and Corbett agreed that Corbett had in fact disobeyed orders not to shoot. However, Corbett maintained that he believed Booth had intended to shoot his way out of the barn, and that he acted in self-defense. He stated, quote, "Booth would have killed me if I had not shot first. I think I did right." Stanton paused and then stated, quote, "The rebel is dead. The patriot lives. He has spared the country expense, continued excitement, and trouble. Discharge the patriot." Upon leaving the War Department, Corbett was greeted by a cheering crowd. As he made his way to Matthew Brady's studio to have his official portrait taken, the crowd followed him, asking for autographs and requesting that he tell them about the shooting of Booth. Corbett told the crowd, "I aimed at his body. I did not want to kill him. I think he stooped to pick up something, and I just fired. That may probably account for his receiving the ball in the head. When the assassin lay at my feet, a wounded man, I saw the bullet had taken effect about an inch behind the ear, and I remembered that Mr. Lincoln was wounded in that same part of the head, and I said, 'What a God we have! God avenged Abraham Lincoln.'" End quote. After his discharge from the Army in August of '65, Corbett went back to work as a hatter in Boston and frequently attended the Broomfield Street Church. When the hatting business in Boston slowed, Corbett moved to Danbury, Connecticut, and continued to work and also preached the country round about. In 1870, he had relocated once again to Camden, New Jersey, where he was known as a Methodist lay preacher. Corbett's inability to hold a job was attributed to his fanatical behavior. He was routinely fired after continuing his habit of stopping work to pray for his co-workers. In an effort to earn money, Corbett capitalized on his role as Lincoln's Avenger. He gave lectures about the shooting of Booth accompanied by illustrated lantern slides at Sunday schools and women's groups and tent meetings. Corbett was never asked back due to his increasingly erratic behavior and incoherent speeches. R.B. Hoover, a man who later befriended Corbett, recalled that Corbett believed men who were high in authority at Washington at the time of the assassination were hounding him. Corbett said the men were angry because he had deprived them of prosecuting and executing John Wilkes Booth themselves. He also believed that the same men had gotten him fired from various jobs. Corbett's paranoia was furthered by the hate mail he received for killing Booth. He became fearful that Booth's Avengers, or organizations like the one he called the Secret Order, were planning to seek revenge upon him and took to carrying a pistol with him at all times. As his paranoia increased, Corbett began brandishing his pistol at friends and strangers that he deemed suspicious. While attending a soldiers' reunion of the Blue and Gray in Cladwell, Ohio in 1875, Corbett got into an argument with several men over the death of John Wilkes Booth. The men questioned if Booth had really been killed at all, which enraged Corbett. He then drew his pistol on the men, but he was removed from the reunion before he could fire it. Due to his fame as Lincoln's Avenger, Corbett was appointed assistant doorkeeper of the Kansas House of Representatives in Topeka in January of 1887. On February 15th, he became convinced that officers in the House were discriminating against him. He jumped up to his feet, brandished a revolver, and began chasing the officers out of the building. No one was hurt, and Corbett was arrested. The following day, a judge declared Corbett insane and sent him to the Topeka Asylum for the Insane. On May 26, 1888, he escaped the asylum on horseback. He then rode to Neodesha, Kansas, where he briefly stayed with Richard Thatcher, a man he had met while they were both prisoners of war. When Corbett left, he told Thatcher he was going to Mexico, same place Booth said he was going to go. Corbett is believed to have settled in a cabin built in the forest near Hinckley in Pine County in eastern Minnesota. He's believed to have died in the Great Hinckley Fire on September 1st, 1894, although there is no proof. Now, I tell the story of Boston Corbett because I think that's an interesting one. Was he a hero and a patriot? Or was he just a nut, basically, who fired on a man who he shouldn't have fired on? Now, you can decide what you want to about that, but as we can see, he clearly went insane toward the end of his life and was full of paranoia. And he's not the only person that had this kind of fallout after the Lincoln assassination. Henry Rathbone was the other man sitting in the presidential box, along with President Lincoln. He's the man who attempted to apprehend Booth as he tried to make his way from the presidential box to the stage. Booth slashed Rathbone's arm with a dagger, and he cut the man from his elbow all the way up to his shoulder. Rathbone later recalled that he was horrified at the anger on Booth's face. Rathbone again grabbed at Booth as Booth prepared to jump from the still of the box, and he grabbed onto Booth's coat. This could be what caused Booth to fall awkwardly on stage and perhaps broke his leg. So we have 3 theories going on how Booth broke his leg, but there is the third and final theory. Despite his serious wound, Rathbone escorted Mary Lincoln to the Peterson house across the street where the president had been taken. Shortly thereafter, he passed out due to blood loss. His fiancée, Mrs. Harris, arrived shortly thereafter and held his head in her lap while he lay semi-conscious. When a surgeon who had been attending to Lincoln finally examined Rathbone, it was realized that the wound was far more serious than initially thought. Booth had cut him nearly to the bone and severed an artery. Although Rathbone's physical wounds healed, his mental state deteriorated in the years following Lincoln's death, as he anguished over his perceived inability to thwart the assassination attempt. He did end up marrying his fiancée, the one who attended the show with him and held his head in her arms while he was passed out. He married her on July 11th, 1867, and the couple would go on to have 3 children. Rathbone resigned from the army in 1870, having risen to the rank of brevet colonel. After his resignation, he struggled to find and keep a job due to his mental instability. He became convinced that his wife was unfaithful. He also resented the attention that she paid to their children and reportedly threatened his wife on several occasions after suspecting that she was going to divorce him and take the children. Nonetheless, President Chester A. Arthur appointed Rathbone as the U.S. consul to the province of Hanover in 1882. The family relocated to Germany, where Rathbone's mental condition continued to decline. On December 23, 1883, Rathbone suddenly and without warning began to attack his children in a fit of madness. Rathbone's wife moved the children into a side room and locked the door behind them, blocking the door with her own body in an attempt to stop Rathbone from entering. Rathbone fatally shot and then stabbed his wife. Rathbone then stabbed himself 5 times in the chest in an attempted suicide, but he survived. He was charged with murder, but was declared insane by doctors after blaming the murder on an intruder. He was convicted and committed to an asylum for the criminally insane in Germany. The couple's children were sent to live with their uncle, William Harris, in the United States. Rathbone spent the rest of his life in the insane asylum. He died there on August 14, 1911, and was buried next to the wife that he murdered. I guess it would be a pretty dramatic thing to be involved in a presidential assassination. That's a very unfortunate story, obviously, but I think it speaks to something that we've had 2 people that seemingly went mad that had direct relations to the assassination. Now let's talk about Ford Theater itself. Now, Ford's Theater, I couldn't really find anything saying that it was haunted per se, but there are lots of stories out there about the place being cursed. The site was originally a church, constructed in 1833 as the second meeting house of the First Baptist Church of Washington, with Obadiah Brune Brown as the pastor. In 1861, after the congregation moved to a newly built structure, John T. Ford bought the former church and renovated it into a theater. He first called it Ford's Athenaeum. It was destroyed by a fire in 1862, and he decided to rebuild it. Now, of course, the assassination takes place in 1865. And the government says, well, first of all, the show, as you can imagine, was stopped in its tracks on the night of the assassination. And that would be the final performance at Ford's Theater for quite some time, because they decided to close the theater down. They thought it would be respectful to the president to close the theater down. But then the theater's owner said, well, hey, look, this is how I make my living, and I've got to be allowed to make my living. I'm going to reopen the theater. Is that okay with you, government? And the government said, yeah, we don't have a problem with that. That's your right. Go ahead, open the theater. So he announced he was going to reopen the theater. But the public said, this is a place that should never hold performances again. The president was shot here. This was a beloved president, the man who saved the Union. And the idea that we are then going to have, lighthearted entertainment in the place where he was murdered, that was just unimaginable to people at the time. And they said, listen, Mr. Ford, we'll support you if you want to build your theater somewhere else and you want to have a new theater in a different part of town, but this theater has got to remain closed. So following the assassination, the United States government then bought the theater from Ford because he wasn't going to be able to use it. So Congress bought it for $88,000, and an order was issued forever prohibiting the use of the place for public amusement. Between 1866 and 1887, the theater was taken over by the U.S. military and served as a facility to the War Department, with records kept on the first floor, and the library of the Surgeon General's office on the second floor, and the Army Medical Museum on the third floor. In 1887, the building exclusively became a clerk's office for the War Department when the medical departments moved out. On June 9th, 1893, the front part of the building collapsed, killing 22 clerks and injuring 68 more. This led some people to believe that the former church turned theater and storeroom was cursed. After all, it had been destroyed by a fire, then the assassination, and now this collapsed. The building was repaired and used as a government warehouse up until 1911. A Lincoln Museum was then opened on the first floor of the theater building on February 12, 1932. Which happened to be Abraham Lincoln's 123rd birthday. In 1933, the building was transferred over to the National Park Service, so now it's part of the National Park Service, which means it's another free place to visit in Washington, D.C. In 1964, Congress approved funds for its restoration, which began that year and was completed in 1968. On January 21st, 1968, Vice President Hubert Humphrey and 500 others dedicated the restored theater. The theater reopened on January 30th, 1968, with a gala performance, though the presidential box is never occupied. So yes, they do performances. They do performances there. I believe they said that the show Into the Woods had just closed a few weeks prior, and they still do galas there. I guess President Trump was there just a couple weeks before I was. They mentioned the seat that he sat in. Yay. And so now, if you are in town while they are doing a performance, you are welcome to take in a show at Ford's Theater, which I actually would kind of like to do. I was not there while there were shows going on, so I have not seen a show there myself. However, I was just there back a couple weeks ago on June 22nd, to be precise, actually. I was there visiting, and they do a very nice little kind of a one-man show to teach you about everything that I just told you about, and it's actually told from the point of view of Boston Corbit, and they're very sympathetic to him, or at least the tour guide that I had was. I think he's a little bit more of a nut than the tour guide would have had us believe, but then again, we know my feelings on religion, so perhaps that taints it a bit. Now, let's talk about ghosts, and I don't mean figurative ghosts like I've been talking about so far. I mean literal ghost. I'm talking about Abraham Lincoln's ghost. There have been several stories about the ghost of the former President of the United States revisiting the White House, with perhaps the most common and popular one being that of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's ghost, otherwise known as the White House ghost, is said to haunt the White House since his death in 1865. Although Lincoln's ghost has also been said to haunt many of his former residences in Illinois, including his former law office. Of course, we don't know what the rules are for ghosts. It's possible. Maybe they're haunting more than one location at a time. Maybe it's different forms of the same energy. Now, we have some celebrities that talk about seeing this ghost, or hearing this ghost, or feeling his presence. Eleanor Roosevelt is one. She never admitted to having seen Lincoln's ghost, but she did say that she felt his presence repeatedly throughout the White House. She also said that the Roosevelt family dog, Fala, would sometimes bark for no reason at what she felt must be Lincoln's ghost. President Dwight Eisenhower's press secretary, James Haggerty, and Liz Carpenter, press secretary to the First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson, both said that they felt Lincoln's presence many times. What does this mean exactly, to feel Lincoln's presence? If you didn't know the man personally, how would you feel his presence? I just wonder, what does it mean exactly? The former president's footsteps are also said to be heard in the hall outside the Lincoln bedroom. Lillian Rogers Parks stated in her 1961 autobiography, My 30 Years Backstairs at the White House, that she had heard these footsteps. Margaret Truman said that she heard a specter rapping at the door of the Lincoln bedroom when she was staying there and believed it was Lincoln himself. President Truman himself was once awakened by raps at the door after spending a night in the Lincoln bedroom. Several unnamed eyewitnesses have claimed to have seen the shade of Abraham Lincoln actually lying down on the bed in the Lincoln bedroom. Now, all this talk about the Lincoln bedroom, I think people are getting a little confused. It wasn't actually the room that Lincoln used as a bedroom. That's just what they call it now. During Lincoln's time, it was actually used as a meeting room. So it was not a bedroom, nor was it Lincoln's bedroom at the time. It was just another meeting room for his administration back when he was alive. Anyway, this is the room most associated with the Lincoln's ghost. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so. I think people misunderstand the title, and so this is where we have all these spooky, ghostly, haunted happenings. Others have seen Lincoln sit at the edge of the bed to put his boots on, but the most famous eyewitness to the latter was Mary Eben, Eleanor Roosevelt's secretary, who saw Lincoln pulling on his boots, after which she ran screaming from the room. Others claim to have actually seen an apparition of the former president. The first person reported to have actually seen Lincoln's spirit was First Lady Grace Coolidge, who said she saw the ghost of Lincoln standing at the window in the yellow oval room, staring out at the Potomac. Theodore Roosevelt and Maureen Reagan and her husband have all claimed to have seen the specter while at the White House. A number of staff members of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration claimed to have seen Lincoln's spirit, and on one occasion, Roosevelt's personal valet ran screaming from the White House, claiming that he had seen Lincoln's ghost. Perhaps the most famous incident was in 1942, when Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands allegedly heard footsteps outside her White House bedroom and answered a knock at the door, only to see Lincoln in frock coat and top hat standing in front of her. She promptly fainted. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill loved to retire late, take a long, hot bath while drinking scotch, and smoke a cigar to relax. There is an account that on this occasion he climbed out of the bathtub, naked but for his cigar, walked into the adjoining bedroom. He was startled to see Lincoln standing by the fireplace in the room, leaning on the mantel. Churchill, always quick with an uptake, simply took the cigar out of his mouth, tapped the ash off the end of the cigar, and said, "Good evening, Mr. President. You seem to have me at a disadvantage." Lincoln smiled softly, as if laughing, and disappeared. President Lyndon Johnson supposedly encountered Lincoln's apparition during a moment of great distress. President Johnson reportedly spoke to Lincoln, asking him how to handle an unpopular war. Lincoln, of course, was the president during the American Civil War, which was extremely unpopular, and Johnson was in the midst of dealing with the backlash over the Vietnam War. Lincoln reportedly replied, "Don't go to the theater." The last recorded sighting of Lincoln's ghost was from early in the 1980s, when Tony Savoy, a White House operations foreman, came into the White House and saw Lincoln sitting at a chair at the top of some stairs. So that is the story of Abe Lincoln's ghost as far as it goes in Washington, D.C., and that is the stuff I wanted to tell you about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Now, again, I didn't do a deep dive into the assassination itself, although a very interesting story there, but I just wanted to explain some of the things that happened after, in the aftermath, to some of the key players involved. I think those are very interesting stories that I had never been exposed to before, so I thought you guys might enjoy them too. And of course, I had to fit in actual ghosts too, right? So this, of course, was inspired by my recent trip to DC and my visit to Ford's Theater. Again, I highly recommend, if you're in the DC area, that you check it out. And it's a good time. DC, there's so much free stuff to do there. All the museums are free, and you just go and check everything out. I mean, it is very crowded because everything's free, but it's definitely worth some time going through. Love the Air and Space Museum. We also visited the Holocaust Museum, which they were just building last time I was there, so that's quite a while ago. And finally got to walk through that. Not exactly a joyous museum to walk through, but very interesting and important nonetheless. We also went to the Museum of the American Indian, and of course the American History Museum, which is my favorite one, as you might be able to guess, being the history buff that I am and the pop culture junkie that I am. And they have both of those things there because, of course, pop culture is very tied to American history. It's one of our main exports, right? All right, so that's the end of this show. As I told you, I will be taking a couple weeks off, more or less, to concentrate on the shows that I want to bring you for August, a very special spooky-ass event. Again, lots of guests, lots of... it's going to be one subject for pretty much the entire month. I don't know if it will stretch the entire month, but pretty close to it, if not exactly. And I think you guys are really going to dig it, so be sure to be here. And you know what? Listen to the episodes that I'm going to post, even if you already heard them, because, like I said, one of them especially is going to tie into all the stuff that we are going to be talking about all through August. Again, check out the website, spookyas.com or spookyasshit.com. They both take you to the same place, and you can find links to all of our social media there. We are at spookyasshit on both Twitter and Instagram. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/spookyas. You can join our secret closed group, the Spookaroos, there, so we can really start talking about ghosts and conspiracies around presidential assassinations. And don't forget, this is your last chance. If you feel bad because you missed my birthday, which was June 24th, don't feel bad because there is still time for you to donate to the GoFundMe and help us try to reach our goal. To donate to the GoFundMe, you go to gofundme.com/spookaroos19. I have to say, unfortunately, I don't think we're going to quite reach the goal. But you know what? We've done a darn good job, and we've been able to get the most important part of it that I wanted to get, which is the digital recorder that I wanted to get for you guys to help build a better show for you guys. So I really appreciate everyone who has donated, and if you plan on donating, now's the time. And I thank you so much for doing it. Again, it doesn't matter to me whether you give $100 or whether you give $1. I know that some of us are in a position where we can afford to be generous and some of us are not. And no matter which position you give from, the fact that you have chosen to give at all means the world to me, and it shows me that there are people out there who care about what I do and the time and effort that I put into the show. So I thank you very much for it. Until next time, don't be afraid.